Hello everyone and welcome to this 42nd Lancaster Literature Festival. As many of you know, after a successful opening weekend, LitFest 2020 had to be cancelled due to COVID-19. So for this year's festival, our volunteer board realised it had to work in a different way and decided to create a diverse and inclusive festival to be delivered entirely online. With the support from Lancaster City Council and Arts Council England project grant, our sponsors and partners, our aim as we near the end of this long winter lockdown has been to bring ashore a rich cargo of fiction, poetry, illustration and ideas, plus all kinds of activities and challenges in the form of a free online festival. Now, as a registered charity with no regular Arts Council funding, if we are to be able to go on creating exciting projects and events, bringing the best in world literature and ideas to the northwest of England and to our international audiences too, we're going to need your help. So during the event, when the Q&A starts, a donate button will appear on your screen, but depending on your connectivity, you may prefer to visit our website once the event is over at www.litfest.org. What I can assure you is that every gift will help us to build towards that future where we can all actually meet again. But for now, though physically distanced, I'm very glad to say we are socially together. How we live next is a series of 5 events that has run throughout this weekend, including 4 online talks by leading thinkers, writers, activists, politicians, and business people. Sir Michael Marmot, Fatima Ibrahim, James Sussman, and Johnny Pitts have all spoken about health, environment, work, and social justice. The series culminates in this panel discussion with an intentionally more local focus. The panel is going to be moderated by AC Grayling, and as you will shortly discover, includes Robert Barratt, Mark Cropper, Gina Dowding, and Dr. Sakthi Karunanithy. So I will now begin to introduce our speakers, and I'm delighted to welcome AC Grayling as our chair today. He's the founder and principal of the new College of the Humanities at Northeastern University, London, and its professor of philosophy. He has contributed to many leading newspapers and radio and TV programs and has twice been a judge of the Booker Prize. Most recent among his books are The History of Philosophy and The Good State on the Principles of Democracy. For LitFest this year, following the success of his talk in Lancaster Library on Sunday morning exactly a year ago, which was in fact the last event before we had to cancel the rest of the festival, due of course to COVID, Anthony has recorded 5 short talks on 5 key questions about democracy, which will be posted on our YouTube channel starting next week. They are models of clarity and I think make an important contribution to the ongoing discussion about the state of democracy in the world today. And in fact, all the events in the festival will be posted on our website and on our YouTube channel. So while the festival takes place this weekend, all next week and the following weekend, it will continue to have a very active afterlife right the way through till the latter part of April. So the order of events will be this. Once I leave the screen, Anthony will give a brief tour d'horizon of the 4 talks we have heard so far on health, the environment, work and social justice. And then we'll invite our panelists to give their own take on these topics in short 5-minute talks. And then he will lead a discussion of the main issues that have arisen from the talk series. This will bring us to about 6 o'clock. And after that, we will have a Q&A, and I will reappear on screen and offer the questions to Anthony, who will distribute them amongst the panelists. Some will be answered by all and some by 1 or 2 only. And now for our panel. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Robert Barratt, Eden Project Chair of Education and Engagement at Lancaster University, who is also the head of Eden Project Learning. And then, Robert, could you raise your hand so we all know who each one is? Gina Dowding next. Gina, if you'd raise your hand, is a Lancaster City Councillor, Lancashire County Councillor, and a former Green MEP for the North West. Mark Cropper is chairman of James Cropper at Burneside Kendal Papermakers for about 150 years, I believe, and founder of Ellegreen, a small hydro developer and service provider. And finally, Dr. Sakthi Karunanithy has been the Lancashire Director of Health, of Public Health and Wellbeing since 2013. So without more ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Anthony, to begin your tour d'horizon.
Thank you very much indeed, Bill. Well, for the benefit of those who haven't heard the talks, but also to remind those who did hear the talks, just a very quick couple of points about each of those talks. So Michael Marmot talked about health inequalities. And he talked about what's required to address them. And he pointed out that health inequalities are not simply a matter of the difference between people who are in very difficult circumstances, right at the bottom of the income scale, but instead there's a kind of gradient, and that it matters tremendously where people live, what kind of work they do, what age they are. A number of other factors influence the health inequalities that we see in our society, and they need to be addressed. Fatima Ibrahim talked about how important it is that although we all desire, of course, to have a good job and a fair wage and a secure home, we need these things in a healthy planet. We need to look after our environment. And the question arises, what would a new normal look like after these dramatic changes introduced by COVID and the effect that Brexit will have on our society? Given that our desires, our economy, our social lives, our working practices are all very interconnected. And in order to address them, she argued, what we need is a comprehensive and transformative new Green Deal, an ambitious one, a bold one that will meet all these challenges and in their interconnections with one another. James Sussman, who has written rather wonderfully just very recently about work, the history of work and what work means, points out that for those of us today, work is what provides us with the focus of our lives, our values, our social status, and indeed it dictates how we spend the greatest part of our time. He's talked about the office as the new village, replacing more traditional ways that people related to one another. Now, obviously, working from home, the effect that the pandemic has had on many, having to go out to work and to be confronted by some of the difficulties and challenges of the COVID environment has been a pressure for others. So the great question is, what is going to happen to work? How are we going to manage the way we do our economic labours in this coming period? And then there was Johnny Pitts, who very eloquently and articulately talked about what has happened since the failure really of multiculturalism in our society, how we're going to think about identities and communities going forward, what the concept of Afropean communities and relationships in our society, how they will evolve and develop, and what we need to do to think about them clearly. So these were the topics that were raised, and some of what has been raised there, of course, we will address and talk about too in this next hour and a half. But what I would first like to do is to ask the members of our panel if they would, each of them, not necessarily responding exactly to those talks, they may want to raise some issues that do come from them, but to talk a bit about their own sense of what the challenges are and what the future needs. And let us kick off, if we may, with Robert Barratt.
Thank you very, very much, Anthony, and thank you, Bill. Good afternoon to all, and thank you for joining this session. I'm joined today by my dog, Lola. Can you see her there? And there's a real reason for that. She's on my knee. Like so many animals, she's played an important role in supporting me through lockdown. And I thought it right that she should acknowledge the role and that of other life forms, the more than human world, and that they play in our everyday lives, and increasingly so. So in respect of the question, how will we live next? I'd like to begin by sharing a few observations about the pandemic and then introduce you to a local curriculum response that's called the Morecambe Bay curriculum. So if we consider COVID-19 in relation to our relationship with nature, then it could be argued that the pandemic has provided us with a window into a possible new healthy future, a way of living in harmony with nature. And by that I mean, over a very short period of time, starting with lockdown 1, a sudden transformation was witnessed. In fact, the global carbon dioxide levels dropped by 8.8%, which is approximately 1,551 million tonnes. The skies lost the vapour trails, traffic pollution decreased, wildlife activity increased, sheep invaded Welsh villages, and the Lancaster Canal cleared due to reduced boat traffic, and people began to appreciate and reconnect with the natural world around them. People intrinsically felt the fundamental loss of access to the natural world, whilst at the same time recognising the importance the natural world plays in their health and well-being. This has raised an important question about our survival. Implicitly, the planetary emergency discourse is the notion that the future is no longer an absolute, that we're not safe. The repercussions are the existential threat to all species, including ourselves, solar nostalgia, and all ecosystems. And the WWF report that all species, including plants, will have to move 1,000 meters per year if they're to keep within the climate zone that they currently live in order to survive. Yet the pandemic has highlighted that a global reset in relation to the planetary emergency is actually possible. We've just witnessed this. We're living through it right now. The question or questions for me are key. So what questions should we now pose in order to recognize this opportunity? We need those questions, and we need global collaboration and agreement as a single action in responding to this global threat. Yesterday, Fatima eloquently articulated a wide range of issues around climate change, the North, and inequality, and the opportunity within the Green New Deal, as Anthony reports. Importantly, the structure, processes, eco and political literacy concerns, and I would add the values and motives that define our political and economic systems. So one question might be, do we have a moral obligation to those that follow us? Or asking the question another way, do we have a moral obligation to nature itself as a single entity, given we are nature? I feel there needs to be a paradigm shift in how we as humans understand and position ourselves in relation to the planetary emergency. That is one that decenters the human and places nature in all places nature first in all conversations and actions that follow. To this end, for the last 2 years, under the umbrella of the Eden Project North initiative, teachers and practitioners from the education, health, business, the community, and the environment sector have been engaged in a quiet revolution. We're in the very early days of creating a new future curriculum that questions the conditions and circumstances that frame our everyday lives and our relationship to nature. They've been thinking about how we can, at a local level, respond to this global challenge. They've been questioning the fundamental purpose of education and concluded that we need a curriculum that attends to our future survival. And for them, this means a curriculum that considers nature first, the more than human world, the physical world, and then ourselves. And most importantly, to listen to, respect, and work within the limits of nature and the stories and narratives that are held by children, young people, and residents and visitors to the Bay. These stories are being collected now and be collated over the long term in a new continuous dialogue with the community. Stories will also be captured of the physical world. This approach speaks directly to teachers' vocational calling, the desire to realize each person's potential and to make the world a better place to live in. Teachers and practitioners have been designing a curriculum, a prenatal to 25 years curriculum called the Morecambe Bay curriculum, that will consist of a range of projects that focus on the land, water, air, community, and economy, each project will be fundamental to our future survival and the future health of the Morecambe Bay ecosystem. Each project will be intergenerational, and each project will be assessed by nature itself. For example, has soil fertility improved? Have microplastic levels decreased? And further, that no project will be detrimental to the ecosystem. So together, the projects will be a blueprint for defining new sustainable solutions for living and working in the Morecambe Bay area, a Morecambe Bay lifestyle. And this draws on some of the work project ideas that Fatima referred to yesterday, just as retrofitting housing with new energy efficient systems and creating more fertile green spaces, for example, for food production. Each person involved in the Morecambe Bay curriculum will be an earth pioneer, an advocate for the earth, and able to establish projects around the bay and in other places. The curriculum is a radical one in the sense that we believe that nature is central to each person's sense of self-worth and well-being. And this powerful relationship is one that we've neglected, and one that we neglect at our peril. And it is one that we're now reinstating. So our question to ourselves is, will this curriculum, the Morecambe Bay curriculum, create the healthy conditions that the ecosystem requires to flourish, which includes ourselves? Well, we don't know the answer to that yet. We're hoping to launch this curriculum in September. But in this place, there is now a secure community of practice with a desire, will, enthusiasm, and bravery to challenge the future, to make it safe for all life forms. So fundamentally, we believe that the education and the education systems globally have the power and agency to lift all boats. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert. That's very kind. Did I hear you say a prenatal start to the curriculum? That seems very suggestive.
You did indeed, Anthony. In Morecambe Bay area, we have very young girls who are pregnant, who are carrying children, and we would like to engage those young people in a positive experience in relation to the pregnancy and their opportunities as they give birth and live forward. Yeah.
Oh, very, very interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Mark, can I ask you?
Sorry, I'm just going to... Yep. Hi, sorry, I'm Mark Cropper. I'm sitting here just on the edge of Burnieside, which is north of Kendal, probably familiar to many of you. Just a little bit of an introduction to me. I am chair of a family business called James Cropper that's been around since the 1750s. The family bought it in 1845. In fact, our 175th celebrations were cancelled because of COVID last year. And that business today, it's been a paper maker, as Bill mentioned. And we have about 600 people here in Burnieside. We're the largest employer in this area. And we make a lot of traditional papers. In fact, most of your homes will have our paper in it one way or the other. We're on the cover of every hardback book. We frame just about every picture that has mount board on it, and so on and so forth. But if I was just to talk about the business, it's really the business about almost trying to confound what people might think is paper, and also trying to take the material in a lot more sustainable direction. So I'm just going to show you this. I don't know how good my screen is, but this actually is a piece of 1 or 2 gram carbon fiber paper we make. And this has a remarkable place to play in the future, I think, of the world, in that this can protect a wind farm tip from a lightning strike. It can plays a really important part in a fuel cell and in the production of hydrogen. It's involved, this kind of this materials are involved in batteries, and so on and so forth. So the things we're doing up here that I think are going to play, global important parts globally in terms of that. And really our goal is, as a business, to be, frankly, a lot more sustainable. I think we are at the stage in our business, as with many, where it's about confronting reality. We have got a massive carbon footprint, and we need to, well, we are, I think, confronting reality more than ever. And in terms of actually, that is the beginning of the journey to begin to do something about it. Separately, actually, from our family business, I don't work there all the time. It has an executive management team. I've spent 20 years in the energy and environment sector, and I set up a business called Ella Green that has built hydro stations around the Lake District and North Wales, and also particularly gone into community solar schemes as well in the last few years. But in truth, actually, both of those are really subsidiary to my greatest interest, which is reimagining the communities in which we live. 7 years ago, we had a housing allocation on actually land that was owned by the family, and we decided that rather than sell it to a developer, we wanted to somehow connect it with the village and do something better. And we ended up joining forces with our parish council and commissioning a vision for our village. And frankly, I think that was so powerful that I also initiated that process for Kendal. And we did it, well, the difference in Kendal, actually, we did it fully open to the public, and we actually had input from 2,000 people. We did that in late 2019, and we're now really turning that into a very ambitious plan to sort of reimagining Kendal. And this sounds like a lot. I mean, it sounds like a lot of different things here, but if I was to say that there's one thing that really joins up everything that I do, it's all intensely local. It's all within 2 miles of where I live. Yes, we have a manufacturing business that ships globally, but really my focus is really almost within 2 miles from here. And I think the power of actually being intensely local, being able to act locally, is that you can really think holistically. And that's really what I'm trying to kind of lead on now, is much better joined up thinking. So you can't think about where to work, how to work, without where to live and how to move to work, where to relax. All these different things are interrelated, and frankly, we cannot address climate change. We cannot address our fundamental problem with our relationship with nature. We're finding out the hard way that we're subsidiary to nature, but that is against, frankly, obviously centuries of thinking. But we can't do that unless we do it in a very joined up way. And I think that really my key message that I want to kind of get across here is that it's really, really hard to be joined up on a big scale, but it's much, much easier to do it on a local level. And that's really where what I'm interested about. Just sort of picking up a couple of comments that Robert made. Do we have a moral obligation to the future? Our business, our family were originally Quakers, and the Quaker belief, which I think still permeates what we do, is about being steward of what you own for the future, and that is precisely that point. It's if you own something, in a way, you are responsible for it for the next generation. And I think if we could think of things and what we do like that a bit more, I think we really can do some good things. I was just going to just conclude by, I think there's some wonderful examples out there around the world that we can all draw on to deploy more locally. And one I wanted to talk about, which is really about land management. It's actually a French market garden, and they've wrote a book a few years ago called Miraculous Abundance. And it's how an intensely kind of human scale management of land can be as productive as the most intensive agriculture without any of the negatives. And what they if you were to jump to the conclusion of that book, they talk about bioabundance rather than techno abundance. And I think if we can move our economy to something like that, we've done something decent. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. It seems to me that initiatives like yours, locally based, thinking locally but exporting globally, have to be a really, really important part of the story. And maybe with all the energy that you put into this, you should be sending free gifts of mint cake along with your exports to get other people to do likewise. I'm pretty sure, Gina, that a lot of what you've heard already must be music to your ears as a Green.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anthony, and hello everyone. Very nice to be here. Actually, I met Anthony at this time last year, exactly a year ago today, when we were in Lancaster Library before the lockdown, and what a lot has changed. So yes, it is absolutely fantastic to hear from local people who have such fantastic ideas and are getting on with pushing those forward at a very practical level. I have had the delight this weekend actually to attend all of the 4 presentations, and just to say to LitFest what a wonderful job you have done in getting together such an excellent range of experts and inspiring speakers. So just to go back to the kind of big scale, one of the things that I found really interesting this weekend is whether people were talking from a background around health or social issues, or the environment or the ecological situation. Everyone acknowledges that there is a crisis. So, and all of these crises are coming together and they are all interconnected. And what I've really, I think we all know that we actually, and all of the speakers over the weekend have confirmed that really we have a once in an opportunity lifetime right now to come out of the COVID crisis and the COVID pandemic, having seen how our current organisation of society is failing us, with some new and radical ideas and some enthusiasm and excitement that things could be different and things are possible, and anything is possible, because we've seen how the government had to react, doing things that we would never have dreamed possible because of the crisis. They actually did recognise the COVID pandemic as a crisis, and they found a magic money tree, which, you know, the kinds of things that we've been told absolutely not possible. So I think there's reason to be hopeful that we have a combination of crises, and they all are interrelated and interconnected, and we have now an opportunity to deal with them. And one of the things that I think we are all recognizing is that there has to be a reassessing of our values. And what I hear from so many people going forward is they want to see justice, whether that's social justice, international justice, racial justice, economic justice, and of course environmental justice. We have to make sure that going forward we have a system, a fundamental shift in the way we produce things, the way we consume things, how much we consume, the way we organise our local communities and our business and our industry, that addresses the fairness and the inequality problem that has been endemic for so long. So just to come down from these big ideas and how we're going to do it, what I really found encouraging, there's lots of reference and about policy ideas. And I spend most of my time not reading these lovely books and inspiring and interesting details, but I end up reading policy papers. That's what we end up doing as politicians. And, you know, I had the good fortune to be in Europe and to be looking at the kind of European perspective. And now it's back down very much to a county council or a city council perspective. But some of the ideas that a lot of people are talking about, for example, that could cut across and meet a lot of our, to solve a lot of problems, are things that have been around for a while. Certainly I've been talking about them in my party for a while, like the universal basic income scheme. So something that actually will start to address the total insecurity and the fear that people have, whatever the crisis, that they're just going to be, and as we've seen during this crisis, left behind and in an absolute state of destitution. And it's just great that these kinds of ideas are gaining more traction. So universal basic income being one that is not just about tweaking the current welfare system, it actually absolutely fundamentally shifts our relationship to work and our relationship to how we look after people in society, and it's a given that we meet everybody's basic needs. And another practical example that Fatima Ibrahim was talking about was the Green New Deal. Something very close to my heart, because I feel as though the principles underlying a Green New Deal are that we will be that there's a just transition from where we are now in society and in our industry and our economy to providing meaningful work, providing training for those people who will inevitably lose their jobs in the sectors that we need to move away from into the low carbon economy. So a just transition is a fundamental principle, again, addressing the issue of fairness and justice into how we need to live next, where we need to go. So in terms of the challenges, there are many, because even though we have good ideas and we know where we want to be, and I think there is an increasing sense of a shared vision of a future that's based on less consumption, and that theme came up a lot from every speaker, less consumerist, a reassessing what's valuable and returning to a sense of values. But when it comes down to the actual implementation of changing policy, there are huge challenges in bringing people along, making sure that those who it will affect feel as though they have a stake in the outcome of policy changes, that they won't be left behind, that they have some agency in how things will be shaped. And I think one of the big challenges is our democratic or lack of democracy, and the need to really look at our governance systems. So we have short-term electoral cycles, but we do have a situation fundamentally in need of review, where we have people who don't feel as though their vote matters, and our whole democratic system is set up to be confrontational, oppositional, and what we need in order to move policy-wise and consensus-wise to a new future is where all people and all of our political representatives have more investment in working together to find common solutions and those compromises that will provide a secure, healthier way forward. So and one of the things it did occur to me is that it's lovely to hear from Mark about the changes in the private sector, and there's new technologies, and you see them, you can grasp them. You need obviously support and regulation change from government to enable things to happen quickly. One of the difficulties in the public sector is obviously, and it's only natural, we need to do a lot of consultation. And so you hear all those voices, and all those different voices about change have to be mediated before you can start to see the swift change that's necessary. So I'm very, very hopeful that we have a vision that's beginning to be shared about a fairer, more just society that is based on a different set of values, whereby everyone has a stake in the outcomes. And our challenge, I think, is working together to ensure that everybody feels they have a stake in that new future.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, lots of issues bubbling up already. Sakthi, your take on these things?
Thank you, Anthony. Good evening, all. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to LitFest for inviting me to be on the panel and to be joining with such esteemed, very thought-provoking speakers alongside me. I was born and brought up in India, and the very fact that I'm here working in Lancashire as a public health consultant, as director of public health itself, suggests how global the world has become, certainly in this century. And I want to introduce the thought on how we live next, as how we live next has already been predetermined by our actions and thoughts so far as our society, and highlight that if we don't do anything significantly different, the world around us is going to become even more unjust, unfair, and not in harmony with nature. So that's my premise for the next few minutes, and I'll outline some of my thoughts on what might be done about that. Well, in Lancashire, we have had nearly 95,000 cases of COVID so far. We've lost, to be precise, 2,887 lives, but it's going to be more before the crisis is over. And this has really brought home how fragile our lives and livelihoods can be in the face of a natural calamity, shall we say, or a disaster. Now, COVID, is that all a natural disaster? Or the way that we responded, what role has humanity played in it? If you explore that further and just look at some of the facts, our individual actions and vulnerabilities and our collective actions as a society has, I'd like to argue, determined how far we've been affected in Lancashire compared to other parts of the country. Take individual actions, the way we responded to the guidance in following the hands, face, space, in being able to isolate when somebody is ill or we are testing positive, and to be able to get the vaccine, not only is keeping, how has kept individuals safe, but also people around them in this pandemic. But clearly, people have been affected differently. If you are the sole breadwinner, and if you can't benefit from the self-isolation payments, your chances of isolating, and we know that from various research nationally as well as local insights, people were unable to remain at home. That, to some extent, I would argue a large extent, particularly in deprived communities, has affected us in Lancashire. And how we responded as a society, particularly with the health and care and the NHS, amazingly well. People often in the front line have taken their personal risk to save others. And also the way that NHS has responded for the vaccination program has been second to none. And nevertheless, if you look at as a population who's been more affected, including in the NHS workers, it's people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, over and beyond what might be called as genetic predispositions. People from deprived communities have been affected more than people from less deprived communities. And certain businesses, particularly non-essential retail, hospitality sector, which some parts of our county has been mainly relying on, has been more affected than the others. The way that the society has responded will determine, or has already responded, is going to determine how well parts of our economy is going to be rebounding. And then the third one really is, other speakers have touched on, which is how we've started appreciating the nature and the benefits it brings to our health and well-being. Well, we can see a lot more birds, and we've enjoyed as a county all the natural assets. Yes, there has been a lockdown, but there has also been a calm down in our communities. That brings me to the point that our health, our lives and livelihoods really is on a very fine balance of how harmonious our relationship between ourselves, the society, and the nature has been, is going to be. Now, I said our path out of this has already been determined. And I said this informally because we still know that parts of our county have got lots of still higher levels of infection. And if it doesn't come down, we face the prospect of remaining in this crisis for longer compared to other parts of the country, which again has an impact on our lives and livelihoods. Now, I see this not just as a COVID crisis, but as a consciousness crisis. It's what we as human society has consciously or unconsciously taken as decisions to act has influenced how successfully or unsuccessfully, time will tell, we've responded in this crisis. I see there are three main things that we need to do or be aware of as human society, as local communities, to successfully live the next phase of our lives. And to do that, we all need to wake up to what's happening around us more than what we perhaps have been doing. We really need to consciously look at how our lives have been turned upside down. The first thing is how we're going to treat our women and children in our communities is going to determine the future. Children are our future, and without women and their well-being, we're not going to have a healthy next generation. The second one is realization that health is a prerequisite for our wealth. Couldn't have come at any better time than this crisis. We need to start seeing, and how well we develop our economies to be inclusive will determine how well we live next. And we've heard from experts and pros like Sir Michael Marmot that this is a gradient. This isn't just going to affect those that live at the bottom end of our society. It is something that we need to do across. So how inclusive and innovative our economies become in the next phase will determine how well we live next. And the third one, and it's really something that's an overarching one for me, is our mindset. We talk a lot about policies out there and creating something outside us. I think this is about time we also look inside us. Everyone in the community, every human being, but more so if you are in a leadership role, humility towards life and nature, and how we connect with each other as at an individual level, but also at various sectoral levels, whether you're a manufacturing sector or retail or education or public sector or voluntary sector. How we live next really depend on our mindset that we need to develop, which really takes some inner travel as well as how we connect with each other as human society. So that's me done, Anthony. That it is, yes, a COVID crisis, but I'd like to say it's also a consciousness crisis that we really need to be awake and aware as we look to the next few months. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you. Well, look, a huge number of very interesting points there. One thing that strikes me is that so many of the things that we recognize, so for example, how essential workers are and how they tend to occupy the very bottom end of the pay scale, how critical this moment is from the point of view of impact on our environment, how much of a democratic deficit there is in the way that our society and the governance of our society responds to the situation we're in now. The kinds of solutions that need to be found to deal with things like, well, just one example is, we talk about the fact that in some of our societies in the world we overconsume, and in other societies that there is a lack of resources, a lack of food, lack of opportunity. There is a great deal of injustice in the world in general. But it's also the case that in order to bring communities out of poverty and to provide them with more opportunities, it's not so much the consumption side perhaps as on how we produce and transport. Do it with clean energy rather than with dirty energy, that kind of solution. But these very, very large ideas and large issues bear on these local ones. I mean, thinking about the northwest of England, thinking about Lancaster and Lancashire and that area, and how people who working in education or in manufacture or in health or in politics in that area, thinking about these problems and seeing how they all overlap and interconnect, it is very remarkable. The internal connections between these things and their global dimension as well. So what I would like is for any one of you to respond to anything else that you've heard there, perhaps starting off on this, I think, very crucial point about whether or not the messages, and you've all spoken about the things that it's important to identify and important to communicate now, whether in the situation we're in at the moment, are the messages going to start getting out? Because as it seems to me, you have a great babel of voices and lots of different claims being made about what we should be paying attention to. And it's like handing around a single microphone to all the different people in that great group. Who do we hear? Whose voices are we hearing? Has the COVID crisis, has the impact of Brexit on the economy allowed us an opportunity to hear some voices we should be hearing now? Robert, what do you think? You've been sitting very patiently listening to some excellent comments here.
Thank you, Anthony. It's a really important question that you're asking. For me, what struck me from the presentations from my fellow panelists this evening, there seems to me to be two things. One is about being in the present, and having time to reflect on and be yourself. And I spent some time living in Borneo, actually, and with local people there, and they only had a language that was in the present. There was no past or future language, and they listened to birdsong and knew when certain trees were fruiting, and would go to those trees to collect the fruit, but not all of the fruit. They would go to different water courses to taste the water because it had different mineral content. But what was really important about this relationship was this sense of their position within the whole ecosystem and the importance of understanding themselves. And I think in this way of life, the way we're living now, it's too fast, it's too busy, and there's very little opportunity for people to connect with themselves. There is no time to sit and be quiet. You have to be busy. If you're not busy, you're falling behind. In education, there's a highly regulated space that's challenging everyone to always make progress. It's called Progress 8. But in fact, when you look at the disconnect there is between the education system and the everyday lives of young people and those stories that are not listened and heard at all, and then you meet the young children and the teachers and start becoming exposed to their mental health, and then you're disturbed. And I just wonder if an ethic of care is missing from all of what we do, and the opportunity within our lives to be able to meditate and have that space when you're not busy, that you can reconnect with yourself and reconnect with others in a spiritual way. And I think one of the things we're trying to do through the Morecambe Bay curriculum is provide a curriculum that offers not just a cognitive engagement and a skills performance agenda, but one that connects emotionally, sensorily, and spiritually with other people, the place, and the more than human world that we're in. So, it's akin to the slow movement. So we're asking for a complete reset of what it is we're trying to achieve. What is the fundamental purpose of education? I'll stop there.
Saki, you got your finger up.
Yes, I think I'm now unmuted. I really chime very well with what Robert was saying there. I think as hopefully we will come out of this COVID crisis with the vaccines and with better border controls and all the basic the public health that we need to put in place, as well as looking after the most vulnerable and the businesses that have been affected. I think you just make me think to what extent we will go back to BAU, business as usual. We really have to start noticing how we have been affected as a whole society, and not race to BAU by each of the sectors. I think we have a great opportunity in our hands, and that probably is something that we need to create as communities, as a society. To what extent we go back to BAU should be determined by to what extent we want to have a new normal that is informed by being able to have a shared understanding of our challenges, but more importantly, the opportunities that we have in our hands to create, particularly with our young people in mind. And that is not necessarily just from how healthy we want to be, but also from a point of view of how wealthy we have to be, or we need to be, as a joint endeavor. I think even the fact that the panel got a politician, business entrepreneurs, and a health professional, we must strive to achieve that conversation at every level possible.
Mark, of course, the question presses, I suppose, for anybody who is in business. When one hears, challenges to not returning to business as usual, they presumably don't mean that they don't want businesses to flourish. What they want is for businesses to be sustainable and, to be as sensitive as you've described yourself as being, indeed, to the environmental concerns and social concerns there too. I mean, do you feel, from your perspective, that we can hope that businesses will really, many who haven't thought as you've been thinking, but will start to think in this way?
I'd love to be more optimistic. I think the last year has made people, the last year has made people think. If I could just tell you just a little story that I think illustrates the point I would make, is that so I've been, the last couple of annual general meetings, annual reports I've done for our business, I've really made a point that we need to be more socially and environmentally responsible. Now, I say that from a basis that I think we are beginning on that journey. So, but I've really made that point. And one of our investors put their sort of hand up at our annual general meeting, the last one when we could all meet, and said, does this mean that we might, like, you're going to cut our dividend and we're going to have less money tomorrow? And the point I made there, and which I think it does come some way to answering yours, is that yes, it might mean there's a cut tomorrow, but ultimately this is about us being a much more sustainable business. So if you're in business and you've got the issue here is how intelligent and adaptive you are. But if you're in business, the logical thing to do is to become more sustainable. And I think one of the most, whatever you think of business and corporations and the very big end of it, dubious ethics, whatever you might think, there is an extraordinary change happening right now where you've got Wall Street, where you've got the City of London and all their global equivalents who are suddenly thinking being green is good business. And, and if you're going to spend £1 on a green business or £1 on an oil and gas business, where do you go? So I think, do you know what, 2 years ago, I think the kind of, we could only have dreamt of the kind of shift we're now seeing, and we are seeing the global capital markets shifting into the green sector. Now, and actually in many cases, this is the really interesting thing, because I think regulation is important. I don't believe that you just leave it to the market. That doesn't work. But what's fantastic, what's so interesting now is so many of these businesses now are going actually ahead of regulations because they see it as good. They see it as logical and as good business. There's probably a lot of people out there, sometimes you get people who are very successful in business who interpret their success as reflective of their own brilliance. And sometimes that can mean that they are not perhaps looking out to the world as much and as responsive. So they might need a bit of regulation to kind of help them to catch up. But frankly, their businesses won't be around for long if they're not careful, however successful they might be today. So I don't know that answer.
Well, amongst all the factors, I suppose questions of brand reputation can snowball as well in the right direction here. Gina, you've got your hand up.
Yes. I'm off mute. Yeah, two things just to pick up on this concept of less is more, which I think is the seed has been sown and is spreading. Innovation, and something that Mark was just saying then, I have the privilege of being on the Lancashire Pension Fund Committee, but it's quite interesting because I do get to hear presentations every quarter about the thinking of big business because of our investment in the global equities market. And I should add that Lancashire does fairly well on scoring of responsible investment. But one of the concepts that's being talked about in the financial investment world is the inevitable policy response. And it's basically business saying, we can see out there that the government or governments have not introduced the policies required to meet our Paris agreements. And there will be an inevitable policy response from governments, but businesses, hey, we need to get on with it because otherwise it's going to come as a shock. So there's kind of like the business world, even big global businesses are ahead of the game, understanding this need for a transition to low carbon production methods, etc. And so I just think this chimes with me, this inevitable policy response, because I think at a local level as well, we can see that policy from government is lacking. It's sadly lacking for what we need. But at a local level, that we've got good ideas, we've got people willing to be more innovative or introduce things and try things out. And that was one of the things I'm hearing a lot is we need to stop waiting for the perfect answer and start experimenting, because we don't know how we're going to get this exactly right, but we can't wait till we have the perfect answer. So just some of the things that we're talking about in the council or various councils is like the low traffic neighborhoods. Someone mentioned, this slow cities idea. So the fact that we actually start to create systems for active travel, so it's actually a pleasure and desirable to do those 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer journeys by car or by bike or walking, so that it's safe for children, to go to school by themselves in the morning, and convincing our high street retailers, and there is plenty of evidence that actually it's not the car parks that are actually add the footfall to your city centres, it's your walkers, cyclists, and the visitor economy. So it's just thinking things differently and being prepared to experiment and try new things.
Mark.
All right. No, I just going to just that business about transport is really interesting, and if you're talking about the whole sort of balance of humans, nature, society, in fact, what we've built is completely imbalanced. Forget about it, not just for nature, but actually for humans. And I think this is the bit where I'm. So I chair our TAT Kendall's regeneration board, and we've just actually privately paid for a survey of the traffic system of Kendal, which when we did a vision was acknowledged as the worst thing about the whole place. It was really, actually, it's been absolutely fascinating. We've only seen the kind of preliminary results last week, but this whole notion of making places and again, the world we live in more human scale. This is not, maybe it should, human and nature scale, but we haven't done that. We've basically built places. And if Lancaster and Kendal are equals, Lancaster on a slightly bigger table, they are awful. They've been built, they were built for the cars about 50 years ago. And there are so many details that we all of us in our generation, we won't even know that they were there. Very tight street corners, basically mean that you have to be much slower and more careful as in a car. And also we have, not half of my board, but certainly people on this Kendall board said, oh, I hate all these mixed road surfaces, things that are better for for humans and cyclists. They're so dangerous. But actually, if you're in a car and you're made to be conscious that actually you're potentially a danger, that actually is the whole point of doing these things. But people use that as a reason that it shouldn't be done. So I don't know whether that's ties in with what Gina was saying, but there is so much more we do. The frustration for me here is we're being told in Kendall there is no money. There's no money. You're not going to get any money. You're going to get absolutely nothing. So I'm thinking, how are we going to crowdfund this? Are we going to have to get the people who love Kendall, who visit Kendall, who live in Kendall to pay for, this at one street slab at a time? I don't know. I mean, we're going to have to be, and this is the whole point about, again, if we had more local budgets, I think we could solve the problem. But, policy being so centralized and budget so centralized, we know what to do, but whether we can do it, I don't know.
Well, Gina, there's an idea for you there. Sakthi had his finger up and then Robert. So Sakthi first, then Robert. But then I'm sure lots of people are wanting to ask questions too. So we should move to them. But Sakthi.
You just made me think, Mark, about if you think about societies and how we've evolved over centuries, if you go back in time, we weren't that siloed, but we have become so specialized and sectored so much. So the way we develop thinking as communities, as human society, has become so siloed that there is no shared thinking for how we think about our thinking, is what I'm trying to say. I think we have to really notice that now we have got the chance to rebuild our communities. We need to start thinking about how we think at the boards, at the cabinets, as well as at each of the household. And perhaps we need to start with the top in terms of how policies are made to have the space to think about thinking, but also start with the young. As we all are getting older, we've got to start thinking about how we build this kind of rounded thinking, much more integrated thinking about living in harmony between self, the society, and nature in the younger generations. And I don't see that happening at scale. So that's probably one of the features that we need to get hold of and do some innovative work locally, like the Morecambe Bay curriculum and many others. I'm sure that will evolve. But I think it's in the hands of the boards and the cabinets to start with, and I think we should start young.
Well, Robert, you're starting them young.
We're starting young, prenatal. I was just going to follow from Mark and Sakhi's points. What we know, but what we're not saying, is that every single year group in our school system has been affected by COVID. And so if you work that through, that could mean that we're dealing with the effect of that for the next 30 to 40 to 50 years. That's a long time. And the narrative at the moment from the government is about catch-up and performance against national testing. But it's not one of a narrative of nurture and supporting young children's mental health and well-being and transition back into a school system that for many has lost its value because of the chaotic nature of their experience over the last 2 to 3 years and will be in the future. And that disruption is significant. And I'm concerned about the opportunities that young people have in front of them, what agency they have over their futures, and what agency we can afford, and is afforded to children, framed by children. Given that, if we think about the national curriculum and the curricula in schools through to colleges and universities, and we just apply Maslow's hierarchy of need, most children go through a school not knowing the difference between a beetroot seed and a lettuce seed, let alone being able to grow them and then make them into a meal. So they can't feed themselves, let's say. And then you say, but surely they can clothe themselves. And I say, well, no, probably they're not going to make clothes or repurpose clothing. at all. But hopefully they'll fundamentally know about the importance of photosynthesis, because it's fundamental to our survival. So we've got children who are hungry and can't clothe themselves. And then we'll say, but surely they can build their own transport. That happens through the school system, doesn't it? That they can make a bicycle or repair a vehicle, electric or otherwise, or no, they can't. But they can generate their own energy, surely. No, they can't. We never do that with them. But surely they can build their own shelter. Well, in a den, maybe in early years. So I'm a bit worried now, because by the back end of this system, you've got people who are saying to us, they've got this eco-anxiety. They're inheriting an earth that they have no agency and control over. And the school system, and the college and the university system hasn't prepared them for that future. But we're expecting them to suddenly transition miraculously with a new sets of skills through an education system that's not providing that into this new future, this new world. So there's a really important question. First of all, from our perspective at Eden, we know that relationships are fundamental to our future survival, and it's been borne out in so many examples around the world where ships have gone down in the Second World War, and it was the seamen that survived, not the officers, because they took care of each other. In fact, relationships might be more important than food supply, although that's a major problem in Lancashire and Morecambe, in the Morecambe Bay area. So, are we brave enough to say that food supply is a problem, and we're prepared to bring not just green spaces, but dig up some roads and bring them back into cultivation? I mean, are we brave enough to say that we're prepared to supply food for free and energy for free to people? Is that an unreasonable aspiration for us as a society if we truly care about each other? And what does that actually mean? So what does the social contract actually mean in the everyday lives of the people that we're talking about, where you have to get yourself a job? And we know we've got right across the country workless generations not able to get into this thing called work to be able to buy that thing called food and the energy and the shelter and all of else, that which you would say was a basic human right. So there are fundamental questions that we should be asking ourselves about who we are and how we sit in relation to nature and the importance of our contribution to the planet. What is that? And so I would just say at the moment, the Morecambe Bay curriculum is a really bold and progressive attempt. It's a small attempt, but we might create a tipping point project that learns something, one thing that might make a difference. And we need more projects. We need more innovative spaces and opportunities and funding and resources and buy-in from people from all sorts of spaces to create, I was mentioned earlier by the other panelists, those exciting intersectorial spaces where we can think differently and create new professional identities, new spaces, new future, new imagined futures for all of us. But we need to start that, as Anthony is saying, and not just keep passing the microphone around and be given the license to do it. One very positive thing in education, lastly from me, is that the new Ofsted inspection framework, I know it's a regulation framework, is asking schools and colleges to create contextually relevant and culturally relevant curricula. And that's a really powerful positive step for us, because that gives us the opportunity to do something different. But we need the time. These things can't be turned around on a PISA score over a short period of time. Eden signed a 25-year agreement with Lancaster and Morecambe College in the area to do something over the long term, because we know it'll take that 25 years to build some of the foundations for the future, not to complete the project. I'll stop.
Those are very, very excellent, very, very fascinating points. I saw your finger up there, Mark, but really we're squeezing the time for people to ask questions, and I know there are lots and people are burning to ask questions. Bill, you've rejoined us and you've got a list of questions there for us.
I've got the questions here, and I'll go straight in. The first one from Audrey. If capitalism remains the dominant economic structure, is there any way for any type of justice? If not, do you have any suggestions as to how we can dismantle the system?
Well, Mark, you're the obvious person to ask.
Well,
Gina too.
You know, it's. I think my first response to that is we're going to get much quicker change if we work with the systems and we try and improve the systems we've got. If you actually try and dismantle, if you try and dismantle everything rather than evolve, so real revolution, I'm not convinced that is. I think that could be a disaster. I mean, I'm not. Somebody thinks they know better. Well, fine, but I think that's extremely dangerous. But I think that capitalism, unfettered capitalism, is without control, is something that needs to be thought about. But there is no more powerful incentive than the market. And I think I think we're going to watch. I mean, look what's happening with the whole marketplace of electric cars. We could never have dreamt that this might happen, and that's happened because of capitalism. So I think capitalism needs to be used as a tool to create more equality and justice, and regulated where it doesn't, as opposed to thinking of something completely different.
Gina, you had your finger up there.
To a large extent, I would agree with Mark. Actually, I think that there's capitalism and there's capitalism. So when we are now talking about the unfettered, turbocharged capitalism of the global corporations, there's absolutely no doubt that there needs to be a mechanism to rein them in, make them accountable, bring them back in, so that they are not out of our national legislative and international, even above international legislation and regulation. So there's absolutely no doubt that there needs to be some reining in. I agree that we need a balance, so that we do need in Germany, I think they call it the social market economy, so that there's a balance between which parts of the business sector or which parts of public sector the state intervenes and where. So as Mark has said, electric vehicles, it's been exponential, it's run away, it's going to go ahead. What worries me though is that our government has been fixated on how can it help the electric vehicle transition. It's fixated that that's going to solve all of our problems. But actually, the market will solve that. The government needs to step in with the other measures that will help the active travel infrastructure and the things that the market aren't going to do, or public transport. So I think there's a role for each. But what we've got to do is make sure that our government, whether left or right, actually helps those bits that the market doesn't deal with. And that's what the role of government is to force those issues that the market is not interested in and won't do well in, public transport being one of them.
Yes, indeed. Bill, another question for us.
This from Izzy Rycroft from Northwest Youth for the Environment. Some people might say that a project like the Eden Project is a waste of money. If people want to experience nature, they could simply just get into nature by going for a walk along the beach, for example. What do you think the public can get out of environment-focused projects like Eden North that they can't get elsewhere?
Robert.
Thank you. That's a really important question. Hi, Izzy, because I know Izzy, actually. So that's great to know that you're at the fest. Good to hear your question. I think it's an important question. If you look at the MINI report, which is monitoring the environment by Natural England, there's significant data there about young people's limited or non-access, let's say, to the natural world. And so there are many children in Morecambe and Lancaster that have never been to the beach. There's many children, when you talk to them, who are saying, actually, is it possible to have a petting zoo? Because I never see wild animals or even domesticated animals. And so the assumption that everyone has access to the natural world is actually contested. And also, when you move into the natural world, a lot of our land is farmed and it's not accessible. So there's an interesting question about who has access, when they have access, and what opportunity for engagement exists there. Many of us are living in urban environments. 60% of the world covered in concrete, and we know at the moment there's a significant problem with young people not being able to balance on even services because they've walked on concrete.
Robert, I'm sorry to talk over you there, Robert, but there's a little bit of problem with the sound quality. Bill, are you hearing the sound quality problem? Yeah. Sorry, carry on again, Robert. Let's see if we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
No.
It's still a problem.
I'll stop.
Yeah, thank you. If you stop. Good. Okay, but I think we got the gist of a very good answer there. Bill, another question.
Okay, this from Dave Carr. Over the past year, many of us have stayed local. We have found local businesses, depended more on local support, and helped more in our communities. Is there a risk that this new local approach increases inequalities across wider geographies?
Exactly. What do you think of that? That's an interesting question.
Yes. As it happens, I think I know this Dave Carr too. I think there is, if you step back and notice what's there as assets and agency in our communities, it is not equally distributed. And to take a view that everything local stays local, I think is an extreme view that may not provide the access that's necessary to people that haven't got those resources. So we do need to build on the stay local and celebrate our local assets and shops particularly. But at the same time, I think we can't get out of being reliant on some of the large, well, to go back to the capitalism argument, I think what we have got in our hands is essentially tragedy of the commons waiting to happen. So the resources that we have collectively as a community are, especially the natural assets and the economic assets, are not equally distributed. And if there isn't a recognition of that and a conscious attempt to distribute that fairly, then I think we've got a risk in our hands to further entrench the inequalities that we have seen and hopefully seen getting worse in some communities. So it does need not just the local action, but a clear policy thinking that seeks to redress or level up and build back fairer and all those things in our communities.
Yes, thank you. Bill?
This from Wendy Haslam. As trees are a vital part of our fight against disastrous climate change, why aren't the world's leaders who are working to mitigate climate change trying to influence the leaders of countries who have large forest reserves, which they are allowing, even encouraging companies to cut down?
Gina.
Thanks. Well, therein lies the question. And I think that does take us back perhaps to the kind of turbocharged global capitalism argument again. So, yeah, why is that some governments of some countries are not protecting their own assets and seeing the longer term, protecting their communities, because they're being offered short-term benefits from big business? They feel that they have to catch up in terms of income streams, and quite probably there are issues going on with the global kind of debt economy as well. So the governments are under pressure. So I think it's a really big question. But can I just use this opportunity to come back to the local issue that we were talking about then? Because I think localism is really important. And I think that whilst we need to do both, we need to reduce inequalities within communities and between communities. But at a local level, we have that impetus to reduce the inequalities within our community. And we've seen that in Lancaster, where we've had enormous responses to appeals for, help for people struggling in the pandemic, whether that's the food banks or with actual practical help. I think the regulation to ensure the link between communities has to have has to take place at a broader level, sort of like at the either regional or governmental level. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of the local in actually effecting change, leading by example, because actually people respond to what they see. So, I think, Anthony, you talked earlier on, there's so many people trying to grab the microphone. We could almost say, let's not worry about the microphone. Let's not worry about talking about it. Let's get on with it and lead by example and show people how things can be different.
Mm-hmm. Bill.
So I think this is probably going to have to be the last question from Julie Humphrey. How can we ensure an effective level of vaccination to protect the community and at the same time respect an individual's right to refuse medical intervention?
Sakthi.
This is a really important one and a very topical one. If you just think about it from a scientific perspective, with such a high transmissible virus, to prevent the virus catching on to other people, we need a very high level of immunization, closer to 90%, 95%, to provide a ring of immunity, which is called the real herd immunity, if you will. And if that isn't achieved, then as a society, we're going to have high levels of transmission again. And not only that, new variants mutate and so on, which can be quite devastating if that happens again during, say, the autumn, winter in the future. So I think there's a balance of individuals' free will, but that's okay to an extent. But when that free will actually is going to undermine the safety of the whole society, I think it goes back to moral responsibility of a self. And clearly, there are people that cannot have the vaccine for a very valid reason, and they are far and few between. So I think this is a question of moral responsibility and maybe putting other people in front of us is what will keep us all safe and well going forward. So I really recommend anybody that's got a chance to have the vaccine and being invited to do so. And there is quite a lot of opportunities to address myths and concerns that people have, which is what we find. So it's not the denial. People are sometimes hesitant. And I think the vaccine confidence in our society is actually growing, which is a good thing.
Thank you, Sakthi. Now, just before I turn over to Bill to wrap up for us, I just want to say a couple of things very quickly. Firstly, to thank you so much to Gina and Robert and Mark and Sakthi. I've learned a huge amount in the course of this last hour. Really, really interesting. And I just want to make one comment, which is that, permeating the discussion really has been the question of values, of what we value and what our responsibilities are, what value choices we make. And in connection with that, we've heard the word wealth mentioned a number of times. And I'd just like to remark this, that sometimes I'm talking about the concept of wealth in one or another forum. I point out to people that the conventional view is your wealth is what you own, your assets, your income, the property you have, and so on. And I say that it's actually not entirely correct, because really wealth is what you spend or give, is what you use, what you've got to do and to make. That is what real wealth is. If you've got £1 million in the bank and you never spend a penny, then you're no different from a pauper. But if you've got 10,000 quid and you have one hell of a holiday with it, well, then while you're having that holiday, you're the richest person in the world. Although, of course, it doesn't last very long. But even that is a distraction. Money is not the point. Nature, our children, the future, our health, our communities, our friendships, these are where wealth really exists. Now, we know this. I mean, that has the power of cliche almost. And yet, one thing that might happen as a result of these great challenges that we're facing at the moment with COVID and with the stresses that our society and our economy are bearing is that we really do think differently about this and recognize that actually in our reevaluations, we might look differently at what we have and what is worth protecting. Well, but thank you so much to my fellow panelists. You've been really brilliant, and that's been fascinating. Bill, over to you.
Thanks, Anthony. Now, before we all go our separate ways, if you enjoyed today's event, don't forget to click on the donate button on your screen, or go to our website if that's easier, www.litfest.org. Every penny will go towards creating exciting future projects and events and strengthening LitFest as an independent arts charity. For example, £10 could enable LitFest to give 2 books to a local school. £20 could enable a child to take part in the next year's LitFest Big Read, and so on. Last thing to say is thank you all in our audience for joining us today. Thank you to AC Grayling, to Robert Barratt, to Mark Cropper, to Gina Dowding, and to Dr. Saxi Karunanidhi. We'll have to say goodbye right now because there is no green room for us to retire to. So all I will say now is I hope we see you and all of our audience again at some of the future events during the week and next weekend, and involved in future projects that LitFest may do and hopes to do. Thank you all so much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to LitFest.